You're listening to Sox in the Basement, a production of the Broadcast Basement Limited, where every show is 30 minutes of good and comes from a basement bar on the south side of Chicago. Pull up a stool, pour a cold one, and join us right now for Sox in the Basement. Heard everywhere podcasts can be found, and always at SoxInTheBasement.com. I love how we put together the last show, and then we talked about Nicky Lopez for like 5-6 minutes, and how they had to get rid of him, and all the reasons why they had to move on from him in arbitration, and then it turns out they already had. They'd already designated him, but you don't find that stuff out because it takes a few days, and then he decided he didn't want to take an assignment, so he elected free agency, and he's gone, and that is the third guy on their arbitration list going into the offseason that we got the answer really early because they decided to let that player go. And right now, as we speak, somebody like Gavin Sheets could be going through the same process. And we're not going to know for a couple of days that he elected free agency and left. And I don't know if it necessarily means that the people that are left, the players that are left, are getting arbitration offered to them by the 22nd of November. I think that there's a good chance you're going to see another name or two slide off. They're doing a very deliberate job of moving through the roster and making decisions on these players. You can tell by the way that it's happening in these little drips and drizzles that they're sitting down, they're evaluating, and they're making decisions, and they're probably bringing in their new manager and talking to him about what he wants to do, and they're probably letting him evaluate. And so I think there's a lot more that's going to happen there. But Nicky Lopez goes, and it was a smart money move for the same reason that Vaughn and Sheets leaving would be smart money moves.
Well, yeah, and we can harken back to when Getz was hired, and the idea that he didn't need a year to determine what was on the team. He may have just very well known that the team was crap, but didn't have enough resources or funds to do anything to get it up there. And you don't go into ever go into a season saying, by the way, this is going to historically suck. So the fact that they're combing through it right now and looking at it, and you're not just seeing guys are going to stick around because the argument for Nicky Lopez was there's not a whole lot else in the infield that you can count on, and at least you know what Nicky Lopez is and is not. But if you're going to sit there and say, no, we're going to let him go, that means that they're looking at his $5 million number. They're looking at the number that he would have gotten in arbitration, and they're saying, I can do something better with that. I can do something more useful with that. I can, and maybe it is Chris Getz just sitting there showing Jerry like, hey, I am trying to get this down to where we are doing this for the most reasonably efficient dollar amount possible. I'm not going to use the word cheap, but basically read into it, reasonably efficient, cost-effective mode of building a roster.
Well, look, the roster should still be at the bottom of payroll, not counting the Oakland A's. I think White Sox fans should be furious and angry and pitchforks and torches already, but they should add more torches and a couple of new pitchforks if you go to Sox Fest, if they actually really do it this year, because I still haven't seen a lot about it, but they did talk about it. They talked about bringing it back, but I don't think they're going to do it. But if they get the opportunity to interact with this team in any way, your ticket agent calls, whatever, you should be really angry if you're not at least in the $90 million payroll range. And again, if you let these guys go, you've got $40 to $50 million to spend, and you can use that to go out and get a $10 million relief pitcher that you can later move at the deadline to pick up another prospect. You can go pick up a couple professional bats. You can fill some things in. You can make it easier on the players that are trying to develop. That's something we're going to get into today, and you're probably going to have to replace Garrett Crochet if you move him. And all that stuff you almost have to wait for because you're waiting to see what happens to Crochet, and the tea leaves on Crochet are really interesting. Getz said, I want to move him by the winter meetings, or at least that's the report. And he's been very forward about the fact that they're shopping him. And I think it's very obvious that they're not really shopping Luis Robert Jr. because everybody wants to pay for last year's stats, and they're like, no, you have to pay for the year before's, and they're laughing at the White Sox. So he's gonna remain on this team. And the biggest fear I have is that he has a good first half, and then Getz tries to move him before the deadline when less teams are interested in him, because it'll be a finite amount of teams that can fit him in there, and he's trying to do it against the deadline. His trading seems to be better in the off seasons than in season, at least through the first year of his tenure as GM. But the Crochet thing, I think, is going to take a lot longer, because you got teams like the Red Sox. We talked about them. The Red Sox seem to be very interested, and they may have the right pieces for the White Sox. But the problem is they're also interested in Juan Soto. Reports are they're making a major play on him. And it may shake something loose that Getz wants, or they may find it easier to move on from a prospect that the White Sox covet that's close to getting to the major leagues if they're able to say, well, we do now have Juan Soto in the middle of our order, and he is taking up a place in the outfield, so that prospect isn't as important to us. So I think that he's going to have to hold his cards close to his vest, and I think he's going to have to wait, because some of these teams have plan A, plan B, plan C. Crochet may be part of their A and their B, but they got to get to the point where they're like, okay, we were able to complete the first step of that plan. Now we're going to go make the move for Garrett Crochet. So the timing has to line up.
Well, and we kind of alluded to that when the news first came out about doing the winter meetings. These teams have got to be ready to make the move, right? And Juan Soto might be the first domino that falls. He might be a completely separate domino, because that's the beauty of Garrett Crochet's situation. Some team that is looking at Crochet right now that you and I may not even be talking about, or maybe not out there in the rumor mill, because you see the Mets, the Red Sox, the Phillies. You're seeing certain teams that are just quote unquote emerging as far as people are reporting. But the idea that Juan Soto, for example, to the Red Sox upends their desire to have Garrett Crochet, that's not what we're talking about. But Juan Soto going to the Red Sox becomes an interesting thing because they have outfielders then to spare. And they have guys that they're looking at that they use that they're not necessarily going to want to bring back, or it may change what they want to do in terms of how much salary they want to retain or where they want to try and cheap out on things. So it becomes just this sort of shuffleboard game, because if there's a prospect that Chris Getz is interested in, but in order for the Red Sox to clear their payroll space to accommodate Juan Soto's what's going to be an enormous salary, sometimes those prospects get packaged off with higher priced guys that don't have as much value so that you get something of value back. So there's a lot of different ways you can sit there and say, okay, a GM can play this. I think what ends up happening is Chris Getz holds it primarily because, like you said with Luis Robert Jr., Chris Getz has all the teams right now. There isn't a team in Major League Baseball that wouldn't, maybe the A's, that wouldn't sit there and say, we'll trade something for Garrett Crochet. Because if they're a team that thinks that they're on the rise very, very soon, Garrett Crochet is a guy you build around. If they're a team that's already towards the top and are trying to maintain their spot, Garrett Crochet is a guy that fits right on in. It's really, maybe you can eliminate some of the teams that are completely rebuilding, but there might be a team out there that's completely rebuilding that's sitting there going, okay, you know what? If the White Sox don't want to build around this guy, we will. And so he's got a lot more options and a lot more that he can weigh against each other. Trying to trade him in season, trying to trade Luis Robert Jr. on lower stuff, and I'm not worried about the lower stats sinking his value this offseason so much as, like you said, him getting hot in the first half and then Chris Getz not waiting to trade him in the offseason and just letting him go unless a team comes through and actually gives like a real offer. I will say this about Luis Robert Jr. I don't think that he's under as much pressure to trade him as he was to trade Michael Kopech, who needed to leave.
You don't have the pressure to trade Crochet. I kind of like had a little argument with somebody who was, representing another team. The Mets don't need to give up this guy. The Mets don't need to give up that guy. And I'm like, look, the White Sox don't need to trade a guy that they have a couple years of control over that's only going to cost them $3 million this year. They don't have to do it. And that's the way that Getz has to walk into the thing. And it's the same thing with Robert. Look, I just don't want the in-season trades. They scare me with Chris Getz. I want them done in the offseason. Even if you're going to move on from Robert, do it in the offseason next year. You don't need to rush that kind of thing if you decide that that's what your plan is. I would hope that you're going to start getting better and he's going to be something you'd want to keep around because, again, you've got 3 more years of him. That's what I would hope. And by the way, congratulations to Garrett Crochet on being comeback player of the year. Of course, our guys win awards.
Yeah, that's excellent.
And we move on from them after they win awards. That's what we do. We're the White Sox. It's getting chilly outside, but there's always time to get to those exterior windows, doors, patio doors, and storm doors. Go to Window and Door Superstore of Oak Forest, where there are no high-pressure sales. They're not coming to you and pressuring you to take a deal now, or it's walking out the door. Instead, you're walking into their door, their showroom. Everything is there, no pictures in a book. It's all on display, owner in showroom and on site. All of their own installers. They don't farm out the work. They've been doing it that way for over 40 years in Oak Forest since 1985. every major brand. It's custom made, no stock items. That way you get a perfect fit. Window and Door Superstore of Oak Forest is a half block east of 159th and Ridgeland at 6280 159th Street. See more at windowdooroakforest.com. And before we get to the main crux of the show, and that is pushing the trade proposals off to the side and trying to spend some of this money that they should be spending in the offseason, since we mentioned the comeback player of the year, Garrett Crochet, and the Sox Nerd wants to talk about him, let's move him up a little bit in the show this week and get to him now. Joining me on the phone line right now, the Sox Nerd, Dave Marin, puts all of those tidbits and trivia nuggets up on the scoreboard all season long at the rate, and then he comes here every single week, whether it's the season or not the season, whether it's trading season or arbitration season or season, and he's brought to you by the Village of Lamont. Want to experience a downtown with real history, great eats and drinks, and green spaces filled with adventure? Visit the Village of Lamont. Shop, dine, drink, explore, and definitely visit during the holidays. It's one of the best day trips in the land. See more at lamontdowntown.com. Nerd, what do you have for me?
Chris, with all the Garrett Crochet trade talk swirling, I thought I'd throw out a few gems on good old number 45 before it's too late. From a selfish standpoint, I hope Crochet isn't traded because his starts are definitely different. Going to the park on Crochet Day was unique because you were virtually guaranteed to see something special. The park just felt different on those days. In my era, which goes back to 1984, starts by Seaver, McDowell, Burley, Sale, and Cease also fell into this category. And if I may, Crochet's 2024 was incredible when you consider that was his first full season after Tommy John surgery, and it was his first full season as a starting pitcher since his senior year at Ocean Springs High School in Mississippi in 2017. Now, on to the Nuggets. Crochet's 6 wins in 2024 are tied for the lowest for a pitcher with a 200 strikeout season. Others with 6 wins in a 200K campaign are the Cubs' Yu Darvish in 2019, the Phillies' Cliff Lee in 2012, the Yankees' Michael Pineda in 2016, and the Red Sox' Chris Sale in 2019. Crochet is just one of 4 Sox southpaws with a 200 strikeout season. The others are Sale, Gary Peters, and Wilbur Wood. Crochet limited the first batter he faced in a game to a .065 average. That's 2 for 31, which is the lowest in Sox history by a lefty with a minimum of 31 at-bats, and the second best in Sox history behind John Garland's .065 in 2005. By the way, Crochet retired the first batter he faced in each of his first 23 starts before he gave up a game-starting homer to the Cubs' Ian Happ on August 9th at Guaranteed Rate Field. The only other players to reach off Crochet starting a game were the Giants' Tyler Fitzgerald with a walk and Boston's Jarren Duran with a single. Among his game-starting strikeout victims were Ronald Acuna Jr., Kyle Schwarber, Jose Altuve, Shohei Ohtani, Charlie Blackmon, Jazz Chisholm Jr., and Francisco Lindor. One more. Crochet's strikeout percentage was off the charts. He whiffed 35% of the batters he faced in 2024, which led the majors, was a Sox record, and ranks 10th all-time. That's for pitchers with at least 146 innings in a season. Before I get to my zinger, a reminder, you can access my blog at SoxInTheBasement.com, and there's plenty of Sox Nerd material on Twitter. My zinger, the Sox bid adieu to Naperville Nicky Lopez recently, meaning that 2025 will mark the 13th consecutive opening day the Sox will have a different second baseman. The last second sacker to make 2 opening day starts in a row for the Sox was Gordon Beckham in 2012 and 2013. That's it, Chris. More than you ever wanted to know about Crochet, Seaver, Shohei, and that cut-up, Chris Sale.
So let's talk about what Chris Getz can actually do without having to get a partner to dance with him on the dance floor. You know, these trading things, you need 2 to tango. It's hard to line it up. It's really simple when you look at this roster, Ed, and you see, like, for example, in the outfield, Benintendi's going to be in left and Robert Jr. is going to be in center. assuming that nothing happens where either one of those guys get moved, you really don't have anything in right. Again, and this has been a problem forever. Deloach, Fletcher, Jokes, all these guys could be something, but they're really not. And I think the smart thing to do would be to add a bat somewhere there. I think that if you move on from Vaughn and or Sheets, and you should move on from both of them, you have a very glaring bat spot that could be used at first base or even DH. So now you can really go for any player that's out there. I think that middle infield may be something that you decide to add. It's not, I don't know if I believe in Lenyn Sosa and his defense in the middle of the infield. Again, I would rather see him standing over at first base. That's been kind of one of those things that we've been pushing. With Nicky Lopez gone, Brooks Baldwin probably slides into his spot in the pecking order, and you can upgrade at that middle infield position, even with Colson Montgomery coming, even if you make a deal. So I would say middle infield, a power bat that's at first base, or you can even slide into the DH spot for sure, and a right fielder. And you can afford that and still stay as the lowest payroll in baseball, or the payroll that's just above the Oakland A's, but really, really low, and accomplish what Reinsdorf wants to do in cutting payroll and go through your rebuild and have pieces that might be movable, and also would kind of shield these young guys from going through another 121 loss season. So these are the spots that I'm looking at. Do you see any other spot in the lineup that you would add free agency wise other than the middle infield, right field, and see if you can find yourself a power bat that might be able to stand over at first base?
Well, I mean, there's smaller things. You can look at potential upgrades for catcher. Corey Lee could be a backup just as easily as he is a starter.
Yeah, but I think Caro breaks camp. I think that's
I know that's the plan, is that Edgar Caro breaks camp, but there's nothing that says that you can't, especially because Caro's a bat first guy, there's nothing that says that you can't work him the way that a lot of teams have worked offense first catchers, which is give him some opportunities at a DH spot and let, a veteran catcher handle some of the behind the plate duties and let Caro come along that way a little bit more. So you could definitely do that. And there's always guys that you could slot into the rotation. There's always guys that you could slot into the bullpen. So the beautiful thing about being one of the worst teams in the history of baseball is that if there's a guy that's out there that wants to sign that you like the number on and can help you offensively, defensively, ideally both in that scenario, or can help you on the mound, you can go for it and you can really justify doing anything that you wanted. I mean, Benintendi as a left fielder could be Benintendi the DH, okay?
Benintendi the DH would be fine with me. Like, if you sat there and told me we're going to put Lenyn Sosa at first and Benintendi at DH, and we're going to put some young outfielders out there around Luis Robert Jr. that can play better defense, I would be like, that's an improvement.
That's a step up.
Like, if you moved out Vaughn and Sheets in their replacement levelness, and you told me that Lenyn Sosa, with the backup being Tim Elko possibly coming up and getting some at bats, but you're going to use Sosa over at first because of the defense, and you expect him to bring the bat that we saw in the last 2 months of the season, and that played in that exact way that we saw in the last 2 months of the season when he got consistent at bats at all the other levels in the minors. He may actually be a fairly good hitter, and you want to take that chance. And then you say, we're going to put Luis Robert Jr. out there, and we're going to go find a new left fielder and a right fielder because Andrew Benintendi is defensively terrible. And we're going to go out there and improve that in the outfield and let him go sit at DH most of the time. I'd be like, that's a brilliant idea. That's something that could have been done. That's something that should have been done halfway through the year last year.
Well, exactly. Once the other defensively challenged outfielder was jettisoned to the Orioles, and you lost Eloy Jimenez there, Andrew Benintendi spending more time as DH might have made sense, especially because you could have seen a little bit more of what you have in Deloach and Fletcher and Julks and anybody else that you wanted to bring up, even if you wanted to convert one of the infielders to go and do that.
If you're going to go and improve at outfield, you're going to have to spend money. You're going to probably have to spend $15 million. You're going to have to spend about $15 million a year on the outfielder. And that's going to be hard for White Sox fans and Jerry Reinsdorf to swallow because you gave that to Andrew Benintendi and we didn't like that. But that's the norm. Like, Benintendi's contract is the normal amount of money you give.
It's such a market value contract
to a professional outfielder. Like, you're going to have to do that again if you go out and get an outfielder. And again, as I've said, you got $45 million easy, and you could still be the lowest payroll in baseball. So the question then becomes, Do you see an outfielder out there that's young enough that you would want to sign them for several years, that you think plays well in the field, and could be something that you move on from? But if you never move on from them, if you don't trade them at the deadline, if they're not red hot, then you're okay with keeping them for the next several years and being part of your plan. And so that immediately narrows down the outfield free agents. Like, the only name that really sticks out to me that feels attainable is Alex Verdugo, because Santander did so well. I know he's going to be out there, but he's going to be closer to $20 million a year, and they're not going to do that. But Verdugo falls in that $15 million range.
He played his way out.
Right.
Yeah.
Verdugo falls in that $15 million range. Spotrac has his market value right now in free agency at $15 million. The reason I always find him so intriguing is the story that came out that he has an allergy to the material and to the batting gloves, and his hands basically have hives on him while he's trying to hit. And if they could just solve that problem, imagine like if you might see a boost. And he's one of those guys that seems to hit home runs better in ballparks that play better for home runs. Like, he's one of those borderline home run hitters. And the rate plays for the guys like that. He's going to hit a lot of them into the second row. And so he may be, for $15 million standing in the outfield, he may be a really interesting name. It does take a third of your budget. And so I think the White Sox probably opt not to go that high on a player and don't address the outfield, which is frightening to me, because then that means you're going to have the Loach-Fletcher competition, or they're trying to pick up somebody in a trade that they get from somebody else's system, just like they did with Dominic Fletcher last year, and add that guy into the mix. And so that may be kind of a minor disaster out there.
Yeah, I mean, Tyler O'Neill falls into that too. 31 homers last year for the Red Sox, nothing to sneeze at. He's actually a really good defensive outfielder.
$16 million, though, is what
$16 million.
His market value is. So, right, I mean, like, that's the thing. Like, you're going to have to spend money to bring in a professional hitter to be on your team. The thing is, you have the room, but is that part of your plan? You have the room. You could take a 29-year-old Tyler O'Neill and sign him for 3 or 4 years at that rate, and it's not going to hurt your rebuild. It's not going to kill your salary. It's not going to kind of put you into a position where you can't go in other directions, and it's going to solve a problem. And that's really the thing I'm curious of. Will they be the kind of team that goes, we're going to solve problems now? That's the worst thing in team building, Ed. The worst thing. Everybody does it. All these GMs do it. It's so stupid. Well, when we're ready to spend money, we'll go out, and then we'll get 5 positions, and they'll all work out, and we'll be able to get them at exactly the price we think we're going to get them 3 years before we actually hit the market to go get them. Sometimes you need to start solving the problem early. I always go back to what the White Sox did in 2004. They went out and they got Freddie Garcia when they were sellers.
Right.
So they could sign him long-term and keep him around. And then he became something that helped them win a World Series. They didn't wait till the 05 offseason to do it. You should be always team building, even in your rebuild. Both those names, Verdugo and O'Neill, would be fine, would be an upgrade, would fill one of the many problem holes that you have on your team. And they come in at market value. They're going to sound like they're big deal signings to White Sox fans that aren't used to $15 million a year and think the Benintendi contract means he should be the best player on the team. But in the scale and the scope of all of Major League Baseball, these are average contracts, and they're going to have to sign 1 or 2 of these even this offseason if they intend in a couple years to compete.
Well, and think back to the last rebuild too. Okay, the money will be spent, Rick Hahn said, and so when they thought they were ready to turn that corner, what did we end up with? We ended up with Yasmani Grandal, a guy that was coming off of a ridiculous season that was not supported by anything that had happened prior to that with the Brewers, before he was with the Brewers, and certainly he didn't live up to any of that afterwards. Still not a bad player, probably paid what they should have for him, but then you had Dallas Keuchel, who was an expensive consolation prize to losing out on Zach Wheeler. And the fact is that just that offseason, there wasn't enough out there for Rick Hahn to really choose from, realistically, to put the pieces together. So what he ended up doing was making compromises. And when you compromise, when you don't get the player you want, and you still spend the money on the player you can get, sometimes, a lot of times, most of the time, that just doesn't work out. So if you are looking at Alex Verdugo and going, Alex Verdugo's bat, like you said, plays well at guaranteed rate field. He does okay on the road. He's going to be a guy that you can pencil in to be out there. And
he's not on the back end of his prime. He's in it.
And he's not on the back end of his career. O'Neill's had some injury issues, but if you feel like, that's a guy you can build around, the 31 homers. I mean, that is a legitimate power guy right there. He's a legitimate power bat. He's a very good fielder. If that's a guy you sit there and go, that is the guy we want as Luis Robert Jr.'s running buddy, because we're going to hold on to Robert, and that's what we want to do. If that's the guy you want, then you go and you get him right now, and you don't worry about the rebuild. Benintendi, again, felt like, at $15 million a year, feels like, oh God, that's such a high contract for us. It's just because Jerry Reinsdorf is laughably cheap when it comes to free agents.
It's a standard contract.
It's just a standard contract for a standard guy. That's all that ever was.
Jurickson Profar is interesting. I mean, they're showing his market value is in about the $12 million range. He is 31 years old. He played his way
back into being a guy that you do give guaranteed money to after being a guy that nobody wanted for a little bit there.
Right, but here's the thing. Was that a one-year anomaly, or did he figure it out? Is he Adolis Garcia, who became like a star and then all of a sudden went back to being Adolis Garcia, and he just kind of found something in his 31-year-old year, and that was his peak? Does he need to be in the system and the lineup that the Padres provide to be able to get those numbers? So, again, you want to find guys that you feel confident when they get here are going to be good. Unfortunately, if you're going to bring in anything, it's going to be in the $15 million range. It's going to be in that range if you go out and you get yourself a hitter to go stand at first base. It's going to be in that range. I don't know if it's going to be in that range in the middle infield, but there's not very much talent in the middle infield. The signing that I think will come, because they're definitely going to sign somebody to stand in the infield. The signing that's going to come is not going to be somebody who's difference making. It's going to be somebody to add some depth. And what they probably go for is they probably look for somebody, again, that can play some defense and that they don't have to worry about hurting their young pitchers, right? I mean, I would think that you want to lean towards up the middle defensive players with a young pitching staff rather than try to find an infielder that's going to hit 25 home runs.
Yeah, and when you look at what's out there, again, the infield is really thin. I mean, Alex Bregman's a third baseman. That's a guy he's going to garner a lot of money. And I'm looking at this by, WAR, and I don't know. I'm on Spot Track, so I don't know if it's F WAR or B WAR, but you're not going to necessarily pay a premium for Willy Adames. You're not going to build and do anything really around a guy like Jose Iglesias, who is he's 35 years old. He's on the back end of his career. He's a depth piece. But more to the point, Gleyber Torres, for example, 28 years old, had some wicked good offensive seasons, fell way off, is definitely not going back to the Yankees. They got tired of his act. And there's a guy that they have his annual market value at $7 million, but he's not going to do that. He's not going to do that over multiple years. He's going to sign that. He'll sign that for this year and try and go back out to hitting 30 to 40 home runs. And he's going to be in the business of being Gleyber Torres again. So that's the other question is, do you want to try and get somebody like that and sit there and say, we'll do this with an option so that somebody who trades for you at the deadline has the ability to potentially keep you around at a reasonable rate, but you can go ahead and rebuild. I mean, is that what the White Sox end up doing? Or do they sit there and say, we think we can fix whatever was ailing you in New York, so come here as a 28-year-old and let's put you at second base and make that one of our cornerstones.
What about Ha-Seong Kim? I mean, I know that people are going to be like, well, he's going to be a highly sought free agent. Okay, well, his market value on Spot Track is around the $12 million range. Would you rather overpay him and give him $15 million a year as he's 29 years old right now and really good defensively, and the bat continues to improve? If you look at it over the span of the first 4 years that he was in the majors since he came over here, and you go, hey, I can lock in something for several years here, make him an every year White Sox player, and fix something defensively up the middle, not have so much pressure that Colson Montgomery has to work out, not have so much pressure that Brian Ramos has to work out or Miguel Vargas has to work out, because Kim could end up being your shortstop for multiple years and Montgomery could be over at third. It gives you so many more options. You could slide over to second if Montgomery's good enough to move him over there. But all of a sudden it fixes one of the many problems in your infield, gives you a defensive player. You're going to have to overpay to get him to come to a bad team, I would think. But if his market value is 12, wouldn't you rather spend the $15 million on a guy like that, which is a rarity to see sitting out there that may be able to help you, than pay $15 million for Verdugo or O'Neill? And it's funny, I'm telling you, if you go get anybody of any impact that you could say, you know what, let's sign this guy and keep for 3-4 years, because they would fix a problem and still be around when we're competing, you're going to have to pay $15 million a year. You're going to have to get over it. And you have to also understand the White Sox have the money. They can do that and still have the lowest payroll in baseball.
Sox in the basement. Sox in the basement. Sox in the basement.
Sox in the Basement. Heard everywhere podcasts can be found and always on soxinthebasement.com.